Chapter 11. They rode as hard as they could that night, held back somewhat by the docile pace that was all the pack pony could manage. The rain came back during the night to make them more miserable, but then, an hour before dawn, it cleared, so that the first streaks of light in the east painted the sky a dull pearl colour. With the gathering light, Will began to look for a place to make camp. Horace noticed him looking around. "Why don't we keep going for a couple more hours?" he suggested. "The horses aren't really tired yet." Will hesitated. They'd seen no sign of anyone else during the night, and certainly no evidence of any wargles in the area. But he didn't like to go against Gillen's advice. In the past, he'd found that advice given by senior rangers usually turned out to be worth following. Finally, the decision was made for him when they rounded a bend in the road and saw a thicket of shrubs set back about 30 metres from the road. The bushes, while not more than 3 metres high at their tallest point, offered a thick screen, providing shelter from both the wind and any unfriendly eyes that might chance to come along. "We'll camp here," Will said, indicating the bushes. "That's the first decent-looking campsite we've passed in hours. Who knows when we'll see another?" Horace shrugged. He was quite content to let Will make the decisions. He had only been making a suggestion, not trying to usurp the ranger apprentice's authority in any way. Horace was essentially a simple soul. He reacted well to commands and to other people making decisions. Ride now, stop here, fight there. As long as he trusted the person making the decisions, he was happy to abide by them. And he trusted Will's judgment. He had a hazy idea that ranger training somehow made people more decisive and intelligent. And of course, in that he was right, to a large degree. As they dismounted and led their horses through the thick bushes into a clearing beyond, Will gave a small sigh of relief. He was stiffer than he'd realized after a full night in the saddle with only a few brief rests. Several good hours' sleep seemed like a capital idea right now. He helped Evelyn down from the pack pony. Riding on the pack saddle as she had to, it was a little awkward for her to dismount. Then he began unstrapping their packs of food supplies and the rolled canvas length that they used as a weather shelter. Evelyn, with barely a word to him, stretched, then walked a few paces away to sit down on a flat rock. Will, his forehead creased in a frown, tossed one of the food packs onto the sand at her feet. "You can start getting a meal ready," he said, more abruptly than he'd really intended. He was annoyed that the girl would sit down and make herself comfortable, leaving the work to him and Horace. She glanced down at the pack and flushed angrily. "I'm not particularly hungry," she told him. Horace started forward from where he was unsaddling his horse. "I'll do it," he said, keen to avoid any conflict between the other two, but Will held up a hand to stop him. "No," he said, "I'd like you to rig the shelter. Evelyn can get the food out." His eyes locked with hers. They were both angry, but she realized she was in the wrong. She shrugged faintly and reached for the pack. "If it means so much to you," she muttered, and then asked, "Is it all right if Horace makes the fire for me? He can do it a lot quicker than I." Will considered the idea, screwing up his face thoughtfully. He was reluctant to light a fire while they were still in Celtica. It hardly seemed logical to travel by night to avoid being seen, then light a fire whose smoke might be visible in daylight. Besides, there was another consideration that Gillen had pointed out to him the previous day. "No fire," he said decisively, and Evelyn tossed the food pack down sulkily. "Not cold food again," she snapped. Will regarded her evenly. "Not so long ago, you would have happily eaten anything, hot or cold, as long as it was food," he reminded her, and she dropped her eyes from his. "Look," he added in a more reasoning tone, "Gillen knows more about these things than any of us, and he told us to make sure we aren't spotted. All right?" She muttered something. Horace was watching the two of them, his honest face troubled by the conflict between them. He offered a compromise. "I could just make a small fire for cooking," he suggested. If we built it in under these bushes, the smoke should be pretty hard to see by the time it filters through." "It's not just that," Will explained, slinging their water bags over one shoulder and taking his bow from the saddle scabbard. "Gil says the Wargles have an amazingly keen sense of smell. If we did light a fire, the smell of the smoke would hang around for hours after we'd put it out." Horace nodded, conceding the point. Before anyone could raise any more objections, Will headed towards the jumble of rocks behind the campsite. "I'm going to scout around," he announced. "I'll see if there's any water in the area, and I'll just make sure we're alone." Ignoring the girls, "as if we're not," which was muttered just loud enough for him to hear it, he began to scramble up the rocks. He made a careful circuit of the area, staying low and out of sight, moving from cover to scant cover as carefully as he could. "Whenever you're scouting," Holt had once said to him, "move as if there's somebody there to see you. Never assume that you're on your own." He found no sign of Wargles or of Celts, but he did come across a small, clear stream that sliced cold water over a bed of rocks. It was running fast enough to look safe for drinking, so he tested it and, satisfied that it wasn't polluted, filled their water bags to the brim. The cold, fresh water tasted particularly good after the leathery-tasting supply from the bags. Once water had been in a water bag for more than a few hours, it began to taste more like the bag and less like water. Back at the campsite, Horace and Evelyn were waiting for his return. Evelyn had set out a plate of dried meat and the hard biscuit that they had been eating in place of bread for some time now. He was grateful that she'd also put a small amount of pickle on the meat. Any addition to the tasteless meal was welcome. He noticed as they were eating that there was none on her plate. "Don't you like pickles?" he asked, through a mouthful of meat and biscuit. She shook her head, not meeting his eyes. "Not really," she replied. But Horace wasn't prepared to let it rest at that. "She gave you the last of them," he told Will. For a moment, Will hesitated, embarrassed. He'd just mopped up the last small mouthful of the tangy yellow pickles on a corner of biscuit and popped it into his mouth. There was no way now he could offer to share it. "Oh," he mumbled, realizing that this was her way of making the peace between them. Well, thanks, Evelyn." She tossed her head. With her close-cropped hair, the effect was a little wasted, and the thought struck him that she was probably used to making that gesture with long blonde locks that would accentuate the movement. "I told you," she said, "I don't like pickles." But now there was a hint of a grin in her voice, and the earlier bad humour was gone. He looked up at her and grinned in reply. "I'll take the first watch," he said. It seemed as good a way as any of letting her know that he didn't hold a grudge. "If you take the second watch as well, you can have my pickles too," offered Horace, and they all laughed. The atmosphere in the little campsite lightened considerably as Horace and Evelyn busied themselves shaking out blankets and cloaks and gathering some of the leafier branches from the bushes around them to shape into beds. For his part, Will took one of the water bottles and his cloak and climbed up onto one of the larger rocks surrounding their camp. He settled himself as comfortably as possible, with a clear view of the rocky hills behind them in one direction and over the bushes that screened them from the road in the other. Mindful as ever of Holt's teaching, he settled himself among a jumble of rocks that formed a more or less natural nest, allowing him to peer between them on either side, without raising his head above the horizon level. He wriggled himself around for a few minutes, wishing there were not so many sharp stones to dig into him. Then he shrugged, deciding that at least they'd stop him from dozing off during his watch. He donned his cloak and raised the hood. As he sat there, unmoving among the grey rocks, he seemed to blend into the background until he was almost invisible. It was the sound that first alerted him. It came and went vaguely with the breeze. As the breeze grew stronger, so did the sound. Then, as the breeze faded, he could no longer hear anything, so that at first he thought he was imagining things. Then it came again, a deep, rhythmic sound. Voices, perhaps, but not like any he'd heard. It could have been singing, he thought. Then, as the breeze blew a little harder, he heard it again. Not singing. There was no melody to it, just a rhythm, a constant, unvarying rhythm. Again the breeze died, and the sound with it. Will felt the hairs on the back of his neck rising. There was something unhealthy about that sound, something dangerous. He sensed it in every fibre of his body. There it was again, and this time he had it. Chanting. Deep voices chanting in unison. A tuneless chanting that had an unmistakable menace to it. The breeze was from the southwest, so the sound was coming from the road where they had already travelled. He raised himself slowly and carefully, peering under one hand in the direction of the breeze. From this point, he could make out various curves and bends in the road, although some of it disappeared behind the rocks and hills. He estimated that he could see sections of the road for perhaps a kilometre, and there was no sign of movement. Quickly, he scrambled down from the rocks and hurried to wake the others. The chanting was closer now. It no longer died away as the breeze came and went. It was growing louder and more defined. Will, Horace, and Evelyn crouched among the bushes, listening as the voices came closer. Maybe you two should move back a little, Will suggested. He knew that, wrapped in his ranger cloak, with his face concealed deep within the cowl, he would be virtually invisible. He wasn't so sure about the others. Without any reluctance, they squirmed back, deeper into the cover of the thick shrubs. Horace's reaction was a mixture of curiosity and nervousness. Evelyn, Will noted, was pale with fear. Just in case the chanters had scouts deployed, Will had quickly struck their camp, obliterating any traces that they may have left. He led the horses 100 metres back into the rocks and tethered them there, leaving the camping equipment with them. Then, with Horace and Evelyn, he had sought the cover of the thick scrub, hiding deep within the bushes, but leaving himself a relatively clear view of the road. "Who are they?" Horace breathed as the chanting grew louder still. Will estimated that it was coming from somewhere around the nearest bend in the road, a mere 100 metres away. "Don't you know?" Evelyn replied, her voice strained with terror. "They're wargles!"